we're like, oh, well, just kind of like ran the numbers with the utilities.
Yeah, it's not bad.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. Awesome. I appreciate it.
It's like,
Hello, live streamers.
What's up?
All right. Perfect. Thank you, sir.
Welcome, everybody.
Well, or, hi.
Hi. So, Robbie's not here. He and some of his family members tested positive for COVID today.
Oh, no.
Yeah, Robbie and Becca, which is not good.
Oh, that is not good.
And Carly. I mean, it's not good for anyone, but
Yeah.
So Robbie.
Becca's really sick.
Yeah, Becca's really sick. Carly is sick
Yeah.
to some extent, and Robbie is asymptomatic, but he, when
He still tested positive?
he still
Yeah.
tested positive. Yeah. So they won't be here tonight, and we'll be praying for them.
Yeah.
We tested just in case.
We did.
We are
'cause
negative.
we're obviously.
So as of this moment right now, and asymptomatic.
Yeah. Well, you say asymptomatic like we have it, but no, we don't have any symptoms, and we're
Well, we are
right.
generally asymptomatic.
Yeah.
We are.
On the day they killed the mask mandate for flights.
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah. Right.
And good old Florida.
Did they
behind
kill it?
Oh, yeah.
Yes.
Really?
Yeah.
I thought they
Yes.
weren't gonna do that, cause the numbers were going back up in Pennsylvania and
A
stuff.
Florida
It was a
judge
legal thing.
appealed
Florida
it.
judge was, yeah, it was only for like, what, the trains, the planes, and some other
Automobiles.
places.
Yeah.
So, like,
Yeah.
certain channels of commerce.
Good old Central Florida
Yeah.
judge.
Ah!
There's no way.
She's from Lakeland,
she's
yeah.
from Lakeland.
Oh my
She
gosh.
she was appointed to the federal district.
Yeah,
and she
what,
was
Mizell
rated-
or something like that?
Yeah, and she is not, rated qualified by the American Bar Association, so.
Oh,
Wow.
She only has like 7 years of experience. I have 7 years of experience. I'm like,
Supreme
Yeah,
Court.
she's like really young.
I looked at her record, I have more trials than she does.
Wow.
That's crazy.
I'm like-
I mean, that props
I
to
mean,
her
if that
for killing a
doesn't-
national mandate.
Yeah.
I mean, that's impressive.
That doesn't I mean, you're more experienced, maybe you could reinstate it.
I'd have
Can you pull
I
rank?
have to-
Yeah, that's not
Can
what
you,
it
a lot of
yeah, is
paperwork.
it like a seniority
from
thing?
there. Yeah, I'm like, yeah, no, I wrote a record, I was like, are you kidding me? Like,
Oh my gosh.
yeah.
You should feel superior.
I would, except she's a
You
district
should.
judge and I'm not. So,
Well, D.R. Horton.
you are worried about, well, you do have the nice home.
You live in that house.
So yeah, let's be praying for the Waddells. Any other prayer requests we can remember together?
Yeah, I meant to, I don't know, I get weird talking on Sunday mornings, but, especially like Easter, because it was a lot, but,
Oh.
I was thinking I have a few. Landon's grandmother's really sick. She has like double pneumonia. I don't know if she has COVID, because if she did, she probably wouldn't tell us. But she's not doing well. And then I got a buddy who lost his mom the day before Easter. And so I know he's struggling. And yeah, so those two.
Hi, Robin. See you on the live stream there.
Hey, which Robin?
Robin Cahigas.
Hey, Robin.
Yeah, sorry to hear about your friend's mom's passing.
Yeah.
And yeah, hopefully, Landon's a great mom.
But the good news is I have a sister. She's like my stepsister, but she had a pretty life-changing surgery yesterday, but it went really well.
Oh,
So
good.
that's good.
My sister had a complete hysterectomy yesterday, so pray for her. She's in a lot of pain today.
Yeah, the surgery went well. but
The surgery was great.
It's
Yeah.
definitely life-changing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Does she have kids?
No, Mary.
Oh, it's Mary.
It's Mary. She doesn't have kids, but she had a bunch of different issues like endometriosis, and she was in chronic pain. And so finally, they had been managing her pain for so long. She just needed a solution to the pain, and it's it's been a long process with a lot of different factors, but yeah, pray for her. She's in pain tonight.
Let's pray. Lord, we are grateful for this time, grateful for your presence, we're grateful for each other. We do lift up these prayer requests, Lord, those who are sick and recovering, God. We pray that you give them healing. Let the recoveries be full and rapid. Pray for the Waddell family who is rapid. Pray for the Waddell family who is dealing with COVID, God. For those who have symptoms, Lord, just give them comfort and let the recovery be quick. And protect the rest of them who have not contracted it, Lord. Let them not. We pray for Aaron's family, Lord, for his friend who lost a loved one. God, bring peace and comfort to that family, God. Be with them in their grief. We pray for Landon's grandma, who is sick with pneumonia, Lord. We just ask you to touch her and take her symptoms away, Lord, and help her to make a full recovery. We lift up Mary, who had a surgery yesterday, God. Just pray that you take away her pain and that the surgery would be successful and that which it was done to accomplish. And we're grateful for Aaron's sister's report that her surgery went well, God, and she's recovering, Lord. Help her in that as well. I ask you to bless this evening, our conversation, and be with us tonight. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen.
Amen.
So, we have the video, and I wasn't prepared to talk tonight, so I might have some observations,
great.
but let's, it's open to all. I know Robbie kind of, will do a little more teaching than I am capable of doing, so our format will be a little bit more discursive.
Yeah.
Thank you.
The books of 1st and 2nd Kings. Although they're two separate books in our Bibles, they were originally written as one book telling a unified story that continues on from the book of Samuel that came before it. So David has unified the tribes of Israel into a kingdom, and God promised that from his line would come a messianic king who would establish God's kingdom over the nations and fulfill the promises made to Abraham. So the book of Kings tells the story of the long line of kings that came after David, and none of them lived up to that promise. In fact, they run the nation of Israel right into the ground. The book is designed to have 5 main movements. The story begins and ends focus on Jerusalem, first with Solomon's reign and the construction of the temple, and then in this last section ending with Jerusalem's destruction and Israel's exile to Babylon. And the story leading up to this tragedy is what makes up the center 3 sections, which explain how Israel split into 2 rival kingdoms, how God tried to prevent the corruption of Israel by sending the prophets, and how exile became the unavoidable consequence of Israel's sin. The book opens with 2 chapters about the kingdom passing from the aging David to his son Solomon. And David's final words to Solomon, they're very similar to those of Moses and Joshua and Samuel to the people. It's a call to remain faithful to the commands of the covenant and to give allegiance to the God of Israel alone. But David's words ring somewhat hollow here because David and Solomon then go on to conspire how they're going to consolidate this new kingdom through a whole series of political assassinations. It's not off to a great start. Solomon's brightest moment comes when he asks God for wisdom to lead Israel, and he even completes David's dream to make a temple for the God of Israel. Here the story actually stops and describes the design of this temple in detail, just like the tabernacle design in the Torah. There's all these gold and jewels and depictions of angels and fruit trees. It's all symbolism echoing back to the Garden of Eden. It's the place where heaven and earth meet, where God's presence dwells with his people. But no sooner does Solomon finish the temple that he makes some really horrible choices and the kingdom falls apart. He starts marrying the daughters of other kings, hundreds of them, for political alliances. And then he adopts their gods and introduces the worship of those gods into Israel. Solomon then accumulates huge amounts of wealth. He builds a huge army. He even institutes slave labor for all of his building projects. Now, if you go back to the Torah and look at God's guidelines for Israel's kings in Deuteronomy 17, Solomon is breaking every one. So by the time that he dies, Solomon resembles Pharaoh, the king of Egypt, more than he does his father David. The next section of the book opens with Solomon's son, Rehoboam, acting just like his father. It's a very sad story of greed and lust for power. He tries to increase taxes for slave labor. And under the leadership of Jeroboam, the northern tribes reject this, they rebel and secede, and form their own rival kingdom. And so now in the story, you have the southern kingdom, Judah, centered in Jerusalem with kings from the line of David, and now this new northern kingdom called Israel, whose capital will be Samaria eventually. Jeroboam also goes on to build 2 new temples to compete with Solomon's temple in the south. He puts a golden calf in each one to represent the God of Israel. The connection to Exodus 32 and the golden calf, it's all quite explicit. From this point on, the story goes back and forth from north to south, tracing the fate of both kingdoms. Each one had about 20 successive kings, and as the author introduces each king, he evaluates their reign by a few criteria. Did they worship the God of Israel alone, or did they promote the worship of other gods? Did they deal with idolatry among the people? And did they remain faithful to the covenant like David, or do they become corrupt and unjust? And according to these criteria, the author finds no good kings in northern Israel, 0 for 20. And then in southern Judah, only 8 out of 20 get a positive rating, which connects to another huge purpose in this book, and that's to introduce the role of the prophets, key figures in Israel's history. So in the Bible, prophets were not fortune tellers. Rather, they spoke on behalf of the God of Israel, and they played the role of covenant watchdogs, which means they called out idolatry and injustice among the kings and the people. They were constantly reminding Israel of their calling to be a light to the nations, that they should obey the commands of the Torah, and so the prophets challenged Israel to repent and follow their God. In these center sections for each king, God then raises up prophets to hold them accountable. And the most prominent prophets are the northern ones, Elijah and his disciple Elisha, right here in the center of the book. Elijah was a wild man of a prophet living out in the desert, and his arch nemesis was the northern king Ahab and his Canaanite wife Jezebel. Together, these two had instituted the worship of the Canaanite god Baal over Israel. And so in a famous story, Elijah challenged 450 prophets of Baal to a contest to see which god was real. So they both build altars and pray to their gods, but only the God of Israel answers with fire. After this, Ahab uses his royal power to murder an Israelite farmer and then steal his family's vineyard. And Elijah again confronts Ahab's injustice, and he announces the downfall of his house. Elijah eventually passes the mantle of his prophetic leadership to a young disciple named Elisha, who asks for 2 times the authority of Elijah. And what's fascinating here is how the author, he's recounted 7 miraculous feats for Elijah, and then he offers stories of 14 acts of power from Elisha. Both prophets were clearly remarkable men, and they played the same role, confronting Israel's kings for idolatry and injustice. And ultimately, they were unsuccessful in turning Israel back from apostasy. In the next section, the northern kingdom is rocked by a bloody revolution started by a king named Jehu, who destroys Ahab's family. And although Jehu was at first commissioned by God, his violence just gets out of control, and it creates the spiral of political assassinations and rebellions from which Israel never recovered. Coup follows coup after Jehu, and each king follows other gods, allows horrible injustice. It all leads up to 2 Kings chapter 17. The big bad empire of Assyria swoops down and takes out the northern kingdom altogether. In the capital city of Samaria, it's conquered, and the Israelites are exiled and scattered throughout the ancient world. Now, chapter 17 is key. The author stops the story and offers this prophetic reflection on what's just happened. He blames the downfall of the northern kingdom on the idolatry and covenant unfaithfulness of Israel and its kings. And so, God has allowed them to face the consequences of their decisions. The final movement of the book tells the story of the lone southern kingdom. And here we meet some very heroic kings, like Hezekiah, who trusts God when the armies of Assyria come knocking on Jerusalem's door. Or Josiah, who discovers this lost scroll of the Torah in the temple. So he starts reading it, he's convicted, and he institutes religious reforms to remove idolatry and Canaanite influences from the land. But Judah is just too far gone. The king, right in between these two, Manasseh, he's the worst by far. So he not only introduces the worship of idol statues into the Jerusalem temple, he also institutes child sacrifice. And so God sends prophets to say, the time is up, Israel has reached the point of no return. The final chapters tell the story of the Babylonian Empire coming to invade Jerusalem, destroy the temple, and carry the people and the royal line of David off into exile. And so the story ends leaving us wondering, is God done with Israel? Is he done with the line of David? Well, the final paragraph zooms about 40 years forward into the exile, and it tells a very odd story. It's about Jehoiakim, a descendant from David, who would have been king if he was back in Jerusalem. And the king of Babylon releases him from prison and invites him to eat at the royal table for the rest of his life, and the book ends. So it's not much, but it's a story that gives a glimmer of hope that God has not abandoned the line of David. So the question now is, how is God going to fulfill his promises to Abraham, to David? How is he going to bless the nations and bring the Messianic kingdom? And to answer those questions, you have to read on into the wisdom and the prophetic books. But for now, that's the book of Kings.
Wow.
That was crazy.
Is that all?
Jeez.
That was crazy.
You see Jezebel's head?
Yeah.
Lying out there?
This was a
There's a
funny one. I
pile of
laughed a
hands.
little. I
Yeah,
choked a
yeah,
little
I was like,
through it.
Little piles of them.
Wow.
It's like Ahab's family.
Yeah,
I was like,
ruined it
oh.
all.
Well, if you like that story, it basically gets just told all over again in Chronicles.
Chronicles.
So,
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Yeah. Any initial thoughts or reflections? Anything kind of grab at you while we were watching that? Carol, you said kind of the humor of it.
Yeah. I thought I chuckled a few
I think that there is an element of irony kind of in the story. Like we've kind of talked about how when you trace patterns within books and from books to books, you kind of see this cyclical thing, almost as though within the canon there's kind of this moral that keeps kind of cropping up. Yeah, like the whole bit about. Well, I'll maybe come back to that.
I had a few thoughts,
Yeah.
but I can hold them.
Go for it.
Nobody else is talking.
Okay. Well, I was just thinking, as I was watching that, the book is called Kings, but it's really not. I mean, so it's basically telling us the story of ourselves, right? Like the story of humanity. But when we read scripture, we're taught to read it through the lens now that we have the luxury of reading it through of Jesus. And how Jesus, I just thought of how Jesus is known as prophet and priest and king, and like the best of all three. So like Jesus is a better prophet because he calls out injustice and is able to hold people accountable and not only give a prophecy but explain the prophecy and fulfill the prophecy, right? And Jesus is a better priest because he is holy and righteous and can go to God on our behalf and can speak for God, authoritatively. And Jesus is a better king because he's a servant, right, instead of a power-hungry kind of thing. So I just had that thought of like how we see this story play out of like prophets and priests and kings and the interplay of like the relationship between those three people in that time, and how Jesus kind of comes and redeems them all.
Yeah, kind of redefines those roles even as he fulfills
Yeah.
them.
Or even just like recenters them. Like we have to believe that that was the original intention of God for those roles. I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, it's not for nothing that in the, I was grateful that the video connects kind of the final description of Solomon's kind of dominion and references Deuteronomy 17, because if you're reading First Kings and you're reading about Solomon and all of his wealth and all of his power and all of his wisdom and all of his splendor, if you're not paying attention or if you didn't know better,
You're like, oh,
you'd
he's
sit there and
great.
be like, oh, he's a
Yeah.
great king. These are marks of success for someone who's ruling a nation, right? He has all these horses, he has all these armies, he has all this gold, he has all these wives, he's made all these connections with all these other countries, except that all of those things were things that a king of Israel was not supposed to do, was not supposed to have a bunch of horses, was not supposed to amass a huge army, wasn't supposed to worship other gods or make covenants through marriage to other nations. Like, these are things that a king is, and like, you know, if you're not familiar with that Deuteronomy thing, you're gonna miss that. That, you know, and it's interesting, I think, that God's kind of idea, you know, you mentioned Jesus as a king kind of redefines what it means to be a king. Except that God, not except that, because God has kind of laid out that a king, in his fashion, is nothing like a king we might imagine. We would imagine a king as being powerful and wealthy and successful, except that those aren't the criteria that God sets out.
Oh, I mean, we talked about it, like probably a month or two ago now, but we talked about the story of Saul and how he's like the first chosen king, and like we see how it turns out when we choose who we want, you know? It's like not the best. Jesus isn't the king we choose, but he's the king we
He's not the
need.
hero of the Gotham
Oh,
deserves.
yeah, he's the Batman.
Right.
He's the Batman of King.
Yeah, if you take nothing else away from tonight,
Jesus is the Batman.
This is not Harvey Dent.
Yeah. Yeah, no, yeah, I mean, Solomon kind of becomes a king in the order of Pharaoh, not in the order of
Yeah.
kind of God's law.
It's just so interesting, right? Because I feel like when I think back on what I've, and if I'm just talking too much now, just jump in there. But when I think back on like when I was learning about Solomon as a kid in church, and like when I've learned about Solomon, like you said, like if you read the book and you're not looking for the parallels, like he seems good. Like he seems like he's doing a good job. He's making money. He's building the stores back up. Like we had the whole thing with Joseph where things weren't great. Oh no, have we had that yet? Yes. Yeah, where things didn't go great and it was kind of good and bad. And then we had David that was good. But like Solomon did really good. Like he built the temple, finished things, had all these wives. Oh, we saw this crazy thing. When we went to Jerusalem, just on this trip that we just went on, like next to the old city, like the old city of Jerusalem is like in the middle of the city, and then you have down next to it, it's called like the city of David, which is like the original city, like Jerusalem of like David's time. And then between them, there's this like trench, like this like valley, like I think it's called the Kidron Valley, that goes between them. And that is where they say all of Solomon's wives lived. Like down, it's like a city. It's like a little like,
Yeah,
not little, it's a big section of the city, like down between.
Well, it's
crazy.
It's the original. It was the original city, like when like the city of David was
Yeah.
this like, I mean,
The original
we might call it
Jerusalem.
a village now.
Yeah.
And in this kind of period of expansion, the city grows, and what was the original city just really becomes kind of like a dormitory for all of
It
Solomon's
was
concubines and wives.
crazy.
Yeah.
It was so crazy. He had so many wives.
Like 800 something.
It
Yeah.
was like 9.
Yeah.
It was 9.
It's crazy.
Yeah.
Yep.
It's too many wives.
Too many wives. And no, not and. Full stop.
Yeah.
Too many
Too many
wives.
wives.
Yeah.
What else?
What about kind of the ending of story? I mean, David's story kind of ends with a whimper. Like, you know, we've talked about, I think, last week, and I mean, in times past, what a mixed bag David's story is, because he does have these moments of kind of faithfulness and promise, and where it seems like God is really, you know, David is participating in God's purposes and God's activity, what God's doing through the story of his people. And then there's times of just kind of abject failure, and it gets dark. And I think the ending, I heard Chris Green say this some time ago. He was like, if you know, we tell a lot of these Bible stories as though they all have happy endings, but really none of them. I mean, I can't think of any that do. I mean, David's story is
I mean,
one.
the Ruth and Boaz one comes to
That's what I
mind.
was thinking. That's exactly what
That's
I was
a nice
thinking.
one.
That one's nice, yeah. Yeah.
I mean, it starts with like her husband dying and her losing everything.
Yeah, yeah. No, that's a good point. But David's is one that really ends kind of, he gives this kind of final oration that, it's a call to faithfulness and worship, and it's nice. But then his behavior kind of completely contradicts it, where he, on his deathbed kind of issues all of these people who he had kind of vowed not to kill. He tells Solomon, hey, when I'm dead, kill all these people. Because I made a promise, you didn't make a promise.
That's crazy.
And it's
He
a real,
learned nothing.
it's a real kind of sad, kind of punctuation to the end of his story. And then Solomon's a disaster, and then we kind of get this cascading story of these, these kings, and the story kind of has this rhythm. And I mean, it almost kind of flips back and forth between the kings that are, where there are good kings. There's like good king, bad king, good king, bad king, good king, bad king. Like there's this like rhythm to it, and it kind of hinges on these ideas of faithful worship and faithful justice, which really, the prophets that come out of this story, that's the two things that they're always concerned with. Like they're either calling Israel back to faithful worship or faithful justice, right? They've either fallen into idolatry of some kind, or they've fallen into some kind of unjust practice, and those two things kind of coincide often. Like it's and the author of Kings really kind of goes out of their way to make sure that we understand like where idolatry goes, injustice follows, and where injustice goes, idolatry follows. They kind of centipede each other like that. Like they dovetail.
I'm trying to read that last passage that he's talking about. Jehoiakim or Jehoiakim?
Yeah.
I don't know how you say it.
Joaquin.
Joaquin Phoenix.
What about that?
Just that's interesting that he's from the line of David, and that's like a little nod to like
Yeah.
the line of David's story not being over. It's like
Yeah.
a real cliffhanger.
Yeah, I mean the Book of Kings is
The
kind of
breadcrumb.
it's a deuteronistic text, which is like a collection. I think it's Judges, Ruth, Samuel, and Kings are kind of these books that are compiled around the time of the exile. And I mean, I think that on one hand, these are kind of meant to be a history, or maybe kind of history adjacent. But there's definitely a moral to the story. Like it's not just a conveying of this is what happened. It's it was compiled at the time of the exile for the purpose of saying this is how we got here. Like these are the events that led up to this point, and from it the reader is meant to kind of conclude that it's that injustice and idolatry that got us here. It's the forgetting of God's promises. What else from the video? Elijah and Elisha. Those guys are characters. There's so many.
They
good
didn't
stories.
they didn't say much about those guys. Although I'd never heard the thing about the double miracles. That's
7
really
miracles.
interesting.
Yeah, I remember hearing Elisha asking for twice as much. I didn't know
Yeah.
it was that literal.
Me either.
Yeah.
That's the same exact
Yeah.
response I had.
Okay.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, that's double. That's
They kind of glazed over Elijah like murdering a bunch of dudes. But
yeah.
I was like, oh, I guess
Yeah.
we're not going to talk about that, but okay.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, that- I mean,
That
that's
she-bear
so-
story is crazy.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, a bunch of kids getting mauled by a bear.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because they called Elijah bald.
Yeah, they were just making fun of him, and he's like, "Oh yeah, it's
Oh,
bear
yeah?
time."
She-bear time.
Yeah. I mean that Elijah story on Mount Carmel.
It's
is
There's no A.
that's an interesting one, because that's another example of one where it's like this tremendous display of God's power, and it doesn't do anything. Like, not a single person comes to repentance. Not a single person comes to greater knowledge of God through it. Like, it's kind of a tragedy. Sorry about that.
Because Elijah's on the run after that, right? Like they basically like put a kind of like a bounty on his head.
Oh yeah, no, he flees for his life. I mean, that story ends with him hiding, like he's on the lam.
That's crazy.
Yeah. Yeah, there's so much there in his story. That whole story where he's in the cave and God speaks to him in the whisper. Like, there's so much significance there. But like, when Jesus kind of summarizes the law and the prophets, which is to say the Old Testament, like Jesus summarizes it by saying, it's a call to love the Lord your God with all your heart, soul, strength, and mind, and love your neighbor as yourself. And, I mean, literally the 10 Commandments, like 4 of them are about worship, right? How we interface with God, and about justice, how we interact with one. The other 6 are about how we live with one another.
Mm-hmm.
The prophets are kind of this constant call to right worship and right justice, and it's the thing. Like, it's kind of the refrain, right? And all of these cyclical stories that we keep coming, like the pattern that we keep coming back to is either false worship or false justice, and then there's judgment and repentance and deliverance, and then it starts all over again. This kind of refrain that keeps happening over and over again. I mean, this was kind of compiled and presented to people in exile for the purpose of saying, like, look, this is how we got here. This is how we're supposed to live. And, to give them that hope, that kind of crops up at the end of the story. Any other thoughts on that?
One thing that sort of, I was thinking as I was going through all the different kings is that in the 8 or 10,000 years since that was written, is that right, about 8 or 10,000 years
It's like
ago?
3? Two?
Dave, this would be about 3.
3?
Yeah, I think that David is like 400 years before
Yeah, 2600
Jesus, so like
years or
2400, something
Yeah.
like that. I don't know.
Well, nothing much has really changed. I mean, in our world today, you could substitute every one of those kings with names of dictators and presidents, and we see it playing out today. That the search and the need for money and for greed and for power, and the ability and the willingness just to kill people to get it, still goes on today.
And the fear, like the humanity of the story stuck out to me on the watch of that. I totally agree.
Yeah, no, it's very much. Yeah, I mean that we haven't broken that cycle.
Without Christ, right, without salvation, that's still exact type of behavior goes on.
Right. Yeah, it's that. I mean, it goes back to the very beginning. It's that whisper of the serpent, right? That kind of what we have. I think the lie behind the words of the serpent in the Genesis story and in the Eden story are kind of the lie behind it is that you need more, right? Like it's what we have is not enough, and I have to take, I have to grasp and clutch and acquire, and it's there in the Cain and Abel story, and it's there in the patriarchs, and it's there in the kings, and it's there in the prophets. It's just always our fear. I mean,
It's there with Peter in the garden with Jesus. Like, it's just there, whether Jesus is there or not, it's there because people are there. And I think it's the reason, like, when you were talking about the 10 Commandments, like how 4 of them are how we relate to God and about our worship of God, and 6 of them are about justice and how we relate to one another. Those things are to redirect us kind of outside of our self-preservation. Like those things are meant to like recenter our focus on God and to serve one another so that we don't turn inward from one another, so that we don't turn against and start fearing one another. And I really do believe that there's these like kind of opposing, these like opposing forces of just like fear and love in the world, and this like seeking of God is to kind of pull us out of that, you know. If God is love, then we are constantly to turn our face away from fear and toward love, you know.
Yeah, I was looking at the lectionary texts for this Sunday because if Robbie
It's
if
not
Robbie's
here,
testing
you're
negative
preaching.
by Sunday, then, I might end up preaching.
That'll be
But,
great.
it'll happen. Like the story, like one of the texts for this Sunday is from Revelation, where it talks about us being kind of a priesthood of all believers, or that's the passage from which we get that phrase. I don't think that's actually how it's stated in the text, but
A kingdom of priests.
a kingdom of priests is how it says. Thank
Yeah.
you. And like it pairs it with the text of when Jesus appears to his disciples in the upper room. It's the where Thomas touches his hands, and Jesus kind of commissions them to go and to forgive sins, and in Revelation it describes being a priesthood in those terms, like that we go and we forgive the sins of others. And I think sometimes we think of that, at least in the circles that I grew up in, because I grew up in very kind of charismatic evangelical kind of context. Like that was always presented to me as being like you are part of a kingdom of priests, so you don't need anyone to get to God. Like you get to go to God yourself, right? You don't need an intermediary. But that's not what the role of a priest is. A priest doesn't go to God on behalf of themselves. A priest goes to God on behalf of the nation, on behalf of the people. And that instead of that being kind of a particular or a kind of specific role, now we all are that, not to go on behalf of ourselves, but to go on behalf of one another, right? Like that decentering of ourselves, that decentering of the fear, that embracing of the love, that's the vocation that we're called to. That's the calling that we have on us, is to kind of set aside that greed, that self-interest, that fear, that kind of the thing that like makes us kind of turn inward on ourselves.
Yeah, like I'm gonna go to God and you on behalf of everyone else and hope that someone else is doing that for me.
Yeah.
Like I need someone else to do that for me too.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, that's I think often like
Right.
I've thought of that before, like that we
Right.
right. Yeah, I gotta stop
I
that.
know, it's all right.
I told Carol
He has a verbal thing. If you hear him say right,
yeah.
tell him he did it. He wants to know.
I hate listening to myself talk, but I went and listened to the sermon I gave a couple weeks ago, and I was like, and apparently I have a bit of a verbal tick where I say right, like I'll say something and then I'll go right, and I was just like, listen to it, why am I doing that? I gotta stop doing that. So,
Affirmation from everybody.
I guess, yeah, I'm just, no, that's probably
Sorry, I
what it is.
didn't mean to stop
No,
you
no,
from
it's
saying
okay.
what you were saying.
No, I'm glad you pointed it out to me, because I do it all the
You
time,
asked
right?
me to. Yeah.
Right?
Right.
Right.
Am
Well,
I
the
right?
next time you preach, maybe if you say it, someone will just say, no.
Yeah.
Wrong.
Wrong.
Not
right.
I'll do that.
I like
Or
to
left.
stop-
Yeah, there you go.
Or we can say left.
No, you just need to tap your buzzer.
Yeah, or like
or
a shot collar.
Shot collar.
Yeah, yeah.
Oh.
It'll look like a
Probably got
priest
some.
one, but it'll like have one of those little things where you shake the magician's hand and
Or if we want to be humane, you just put citronella in in, and that's crazy.
Sort of what color is.
Yeah, that's what they use for dog collars
Oh
if you
my
don't want
gosh.
to buzz them.
Oh, yeah.
We've got shocking, but not no sense.
Sorry, I'm sorry how we got
The
here.
little
my
dog
fault.
is too small for shocking, but the vibration doesn't work, so Centronella is.
No,
She hates it. So don't you.
I'm sorry.
No, it's okay.
It was good. The thought was good.
I think that was kind of interesting. I have no idea what we've been talking about, but the whole like people.
I mean, everything, obviously.
So I think the one thing you said that was kind of interesting was other people making sure other people are kind of interceding for you as well.
Mhm.
And this society, like where we're all independent and we take care of our own issues and whatnot, I never ask anybody to pray for me except him, like ever.
Mm.
And I never thought about it that way, like asking.
Yeah.
You need to ask for help. You need people to kind of intercede for you, not just do it yourself. Not always just be the ones praying for yourself, and the only people praying for your family kind of thing.
Yeah.
So that's interesting.
Yeah.
But you always feel like I need to pray for other people because that's like a goal to do, but to want other people to pray for you is kind of like, oh no, that's a little uncomfortable.
Yeah,
Oh, gosh,
it kind of
yeah.
goes back to our conversation about foot
Feet
washing.
washing,
Yeah,
right,
right.
right.
Yeah,
Like, the act of being served kind of requires this different kind of
Oh, I
humility.
hate it.
Right.
Right?
I mean, I can only have my feet touched by little Vietnamese women.
I don't mind doing it for people, but I hate having it done for me.
Right.
Well,
I honestly really
that's
do.
such a good point though, because like when I went through that breathing thing for like 2 months, and I never asked one person to pray for me, not even my mom. I mean, she does anyway, right? She knows I need it, right?
Yeah.
But I mean, I could have gotten up and said, hey, I'm really struggling with this asthma, can you pray for me? And I didn't even think about doing it. Not that I not do it, I didn't even think about doing it.
Yeah.
And that's just not right, right? You
Yeah.
should reach out.
Right.
But not
We
just
should.
to make it a two-way street though. Like, hey, I've been doing it for you guys, so now I can like when I need it, then you know what I mean. So
Right.
not to always just be the one,
Yeah.
because you only do it in your head, right? Like
I
tell people
think
you're
that's
praying
why we practice it every week is to get in the habit of asking.
Yeah, it's a really special part of the service. I like
Yeah,
it.
I think it's
Yeah, we
important.
didn't, it's relatively recent. We
It's
didn't used to
really
have it.
important.
Mhm.
post-COVID.
Yeah, yeah. We, yeah, I mean, that's kind of the flip side to the whole, I mean, if we, kind of purpose ourselves to come into this community, to this place, and, serve, if everyone does that, like, it's not just about like, how capable am I of serving everyone here, but I'm coming into this place where everyone here is also oriented to serve, like where my needs can also be met, like, and I can in that vulnerability kind of open up and say, hey, I'm not doing so hot, or I need help in this area, and not just for prayer, although certainly for prayer, but we can also serve and actually meet the needs of one another. I mean, that's such a clear image of the early church, right? Like in Acts chapter 4, I think, at the end of that chapter, where it talks about how they gathered together and they broke bread and they devoted themselves to prayer and teaching, and they met each other's needs. They gave what they had as according to what each could do, and they met each other's needs, and the Lord added to their numbers daily. Like, the early church was a place where people saw needs being met and lives being enriched in not just spiritual but in practical ways.
And you can back that right back to all the kings that they talked about in the video. If they would have served the people instead of themselves, then they wouldn't have gotten so much trouble. I mean, if their main goal would be to serve the people and help the people and make their kingdoms be better for all the people instead of themselves, they wouldn't have got. They wouldn't have went down.
Well, that's the curse of power, is
Right.
that power only breeds the need for more
More
power.
power,
Yeah.
I think that's like part of our, like you were saying, Amy, like part of the thing about our culture where we're self-sufficient, and it kind of wrings the humanity out of you a little bit.
It's a lot of cultures like to talk about how we're all narcissistic about it, but in reality, I think we've been raised not to want to be a burden to anybody.
All right,
The way we
yeah.
want to take care of our parents the same way other cultures do.
Yeah,
But in the
set our
a lot of
kids
times
up so
parents
they don't have
want
to, yeah.
A lot of elderly parents want to be in an assisted living so they don't feel like they're burdens to their family,
Right.
or won't ever live with their kids.
But generationally, isn't that changing? Like, I feel like, I don't know, maybe it's just because I'm getting old and
Yeah, but the
grouchy,
thing-
but it seems like the newer generation, like, seems like a little bit more burdensome. Like, wants people to be there for, I don't know.
Well, I was just meaning like, yeah, I guess, because I think there's, young people like to be open and honest, and it's a whole like thing.
Yeah, it's definitely a thing with the younger people now
Being
where
stoic's not.
they're vulnerable about needing things and
Yeah.
emotional health, and I think that's good. I mean,
Yeah.
I think that's what like Eastern cultures really get right, is like the care for the generations of their family, and really there's a lot of that. But what I was gonna say was, I heard one of my pastors when I was in New York say something about serving, like how, you know, how we talk about this kind of dual nature of Jesus, like he was God and man. And in a certain way, we are kind of human and spirit as well. We kind of engage God on those two planes. And how serving is how we engage the spirit of ourselves, like the spirit in which we serve others. But our needing one another is our humanity, and we have to engage that part too. And if I'm not bringing my humanity to the table, then I'm not allowing you all to engage your spirituality, right? If I'm not bringing my need, there's nothing to serve. So it's both, like it's both and for all of us. And if we have to kind of keep that in balance, and that's why there's accountability, and we talk about people who are imbalanced in that, and you know, like we work through those like interpersonal issues, but like that's how we really are all in. I thought that was really good.
Yeah. It makes me think of, there was, a few weeks ago, Robbie talked about, there's that story where Mary, Lazarus' sister, anoints Jesus' feet and uses this very expensive perfume,
Spikenard.
spikenard, yeah. Which I have some, I found some, we have a little bottle of it. It's very
Of course
strong
you do.
smelling stuff.
Ooh.
Yeah.
That's
I wanna
really
smell it.
It's a lot cheaper now.
Where is it?
It's in the,
I wanna smell it.
I used it in the,
It smells just like
How do they
Jesus'
date that
feet.
down?
huh?
Are they guessing?
Oh, no, it's not the original one, it's just some that's still growing. I think he thinks the spikenard from that time.
No.
Oh, no, it's
No,
it's new.
It's new spikenard.
Well, how did they know it was spikenard?
Right,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, they
I
know.
mean,
It's
do
in
we
the
have,
story.
like-
I mean, I think it's
It is known.
It's not, yeah, I think it's not lost, like, information.
I guess with it being
I'm
like a
trying to
year's
love
worth
that
of
joke.
salary, that was like the only thing in the market selling for
No,
that.
but frankincense and myrrh, frankincense is an essential oil that you can buy from doTERRA now, so,
Yeah, no, I got this from an essential
Yeah.
oil website.
of course you did.
Yeah.
Called Amazon.com.
There you go, yeah.
The essential oil website.
No, I used it, cause it,
Bezos is the
when,
team leader.
a few years ago with the Way of the Cross thing that we do on Good Friday, there was this,
Ultimate home lover.
we gave these little pouches of burial spices,
Mhm.
and that was one of them that I
Yeah, it
added
was
to
for the
it.
way.
But anyway, in that story,
Oh, yeah.
you know, Judas kind of sees this act of kind of very lavish, extravagant worship, and kind of, you know, talks about how that could have, you know, that should have been sold and it could have fed all these hungry people. And Judas kind of casts this false dichotomy between worship and service. Like that division doesn't exist, right? Like that's why we call it the Great Commandment, to love God and love our neighbor. Like it's not the Great Commandments, it's not the two, it's one commandment. And we can't expect or hope to do one without the other. Because if we try and divorce that, if we try and separate worship and service, what we do is we become, it feeds our selfishness, right? Like when we worship, when we expect to kind of come to God and have intimacy with God and relationship with God and worship with God and not serve our brother, then it becomes this kind of narcissistic kind of
It's an ego
self,
feed.
it's an
Yeah.
ego feed,
Yeah.
that's a good way
Like
to
the
put it.
only part of us that needs that separation is our ego.
Yeah. And likewise, if we go and try and serve and, serve the world, but it's not grounded and founded in love of God and in a sense of purpose and vocation and calling from God.
And seeing God
It becomes
in the
self,
world.
and that's, I mean, we kind of get a hint of that with Judas, right? It's like, even in that passage, it's like, hey, by the way, Judas didn't actually care about the poor. It turns out he was stealing from the treasury all along, right? It becomes kind of this self-gratifying thing. It becomes selfish.
Yeah, it's a whitewashed tomb. It's like Judas felt like he needed to voice that about what Mary was doing because,
He had lots of guilt, and he wanted somebody to in his mind, to be guiltier.
yeah,
Yeah. Yeah, it kind of,
that's,
yeah,
that's
there's
just
a,
ego.
in
you
a
know?
sense of kind of,
Self-righteousness,
kind of moral superiority there,
Mhm.
right? Like, yeah.
Or
I
at least
think-
trying to, so he didn't have to be
Yeah.
honest with what was going on.
Yeah.
Knowing what we know, he just wasn't a very nice guy.
Sounds
He
like
was sort of a bad hire.
Yeah. Yeah.
I don't know, man.
I still feel bad for that guy. I feel like,
Judas is all of us.
yeah.
Had to have him, right? Had to have him.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's,
The Gospel of Judas is kind of crazy. Have you read that?
Mhm.
It's crazy.
it's a Gnostic gospel, and it kind of tries to retcon Judas's story a
Yeah.
bit to say that he was actually, like, Jesus had actually, like, commissioned him to do the things that he
Yeah,
did.
it's not canon, but it's
Well-
That is a reason it's not canon.
yeah, it's crazy. It's crazy.
Yeah, it's
But I'll tell you one good thing that it does is something that we should kind of hold for all of us, which is it kind of helps you find compassion for Judas in that role. I think he gets kind of demonized. I mean, he's definitely the bad guy in the story, right?
Think.
But even bad
Yeah.
guys, you've got to find compassion for
They're
everyone.
all the bad guys in the stories. David is not the best. Like,
Yeah, Solomon.
they're
We
all
were
the
just
bad guys. They all love I mean, obviously Judas maybe didn't love Jesus as much as he should have, but I mean, he ends up committing suicide, so I'm sure there was some kind of
Yeah.
something going on there with his conscience. But they're all bad guys. But I think by the Jesus story, you forget that they were all bad guys. Like, they all
Yeah.
messed up badly. Like,
100%.
Solomon did everything so badly it split the kingdom right after him. Like, that's not wisdom. Like, you know, like,
Yes.
anyway, they were all stupid.
yeah.
Which is actually what we're talking
And
about
really,
tonight. Solomon.
before all that,
Just-
really, if just stealing some coins out of the coffers was like, that's not anything compared to like putting somebody on a battlefield to die, like,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
doing everything you could to like make it happen. He's not sleeping with her now, so I gotta move him over. He won't do it. He's too good of a guy. I better go murder him. You know?
Yeah.
It's the story.
Yeah.
Trash.
No, I mean, you have, Peter and Judas kind of are these parallel stories of betrayals of Christ.
Mm-hmm.
And it's interesting, Peter kind of gets redeemed, and Judas doesn't. And like, I find the way that those stories are kind of told side by side, really interesting. I think one of the differences, if not kind of the major difference, is Peter stays with the other disciples. Like, Peter keeps himself in community, whereas Judas goes and kind of isolates. He goes out on his own. And I mean, it's only speculative. I have to wonder, like, if Judas had gone back, like, if he would have, if the community couldn't have held him up and helped him find redemption too.
I don't know if the community would have, but I think Jesus would have.
Jesus would
Oh,
have.
Jesus
I mean, that would have
definitely
been
would've.
like an amazing
So, I mean,
reunion.
you could totally spin it in that if he really thought well enough of Jesus and his powers, he could have been like, he's gonna get himself out of this. God's gonna get him out of this. It's gonna be fine. This is not gonna be.
That's basically what the story does.
Yeah, so like in his mind, I don't know that he knew he was condemning him to death. Like, even though Jesus is like, I'm gonna die in a couple days, but
Who knows?
you know.
But
We
none
don't
of the
really
disciples
get
seem to have gotten that.
Yeah.
They all were like, oh.
Well, it's not gonna be me that betrays you because like I don't do that kind of stuff. But is it better than you?
Yeah, we don't really get like the inside track, which is what I think probably the gospel really embellishes that. I use the word gospel more as a title than like a.
I mean, it could just be lying to yourself, like trying to make yourself feel better about like the bad deeds you do. But I can
Yeah.
imagine being like, I really thought he would get out of this situation.
And if I'm Judas,
and kind of in the end does get himself out of the situation because he comes back alive. But
yeah,
Yeah, I'm sure there's
Right.
no emotional damage whatsoever.
Judas was
But-
like, "You're welcome."
I mean, honestly, if he'd held out, a couple more days, Judas' story might have went a different way.
"Oh my
Oh, you're
gosh."
back? I'm so sorry. Are you okay?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean,
And like you could say, like back to our conversation about like fear and fear versus love, like the Peter story, the redemption is love. Like, do you
Yeah.
love me? Do you love me? And Judas doesn't come back because I'm sure he was afraid there was gonna be some retribution.
That's the time Peter's gonna be like, "Yep, I got my sword now."
Yeah, like
Yeah.
fear, right?
Fear.
So that's the excommunication is because it's based in fear.
yeah, and that Peter was operating in fear is evident by the fact that he's willing to kill,
Mm.
and he's not willing to die, right?
I worry about that story too. I'm sorry, I'm full of a lot of opinions today.
That's
and
great.
talking. I worry about that story. Like when he was in the garden and he had his sword and he's like trying to do the things he's supposed to do, and he thinks by the time Jesus is taken away and he does deny him, I don't think he knew what he was supposed to do. You're not supposed to take ears off. Put that back on. So we had our swords, but now we don't need our swords. So what are we doing with this? He's going up here. I don't know who he's with or how he's going to get there, but I know that if I say I'm with him, then am I even going to end up in the same place as him? Like, so, I mean, I don't know. I could see myself standing out going, I don't know what's happening, but I'm just going to stay here and like, okay, don't talk to me right now.
Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know him, but I gotta pay attention, to figure out
I
where I
get-
fit in this.
I totally get why.
Not
Peter
just to
did it.
save himself, but just to not know what to do.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I mean, plus it's a Roman soldier showing up. I mean,
Yeah.
that's like a SWAT team showing up. You're gonna be like,
Yeah, exactly.
keep your distance.
Especially if you're not allowed to like do something about it.
Yeah, it's and it's also like the ear he cut off was like one of the priest's servants.
Okay, it wasn't. It wasn't.
So
the
like
best.
you've got giant Roman soldier, giant Roman soldier, giant Roman soldier, little servant boy, and he's like, I got this one. He's like, I was just bringing water.
He told me to come here. Oh my god.
This one I can take. Yeah.
Poor guy.
That guy's got the magic powers. I don't.
Yeah, exactly. Well, this is good stuff, guys.
Yeah.
And I apologize for not being better prepared this evening, but with any luck, either Robbie will be back next week, or I'll know
So-
in advance that I'm
If you are planning on preaching, at what part of the floor are you planning on preaching on?
the probably the platform. Yeah.
Good
Why?
choice. Because a lot of them are staying low now, and I can't see.
Oh, yeah.
We're going back to the.
Like a couple weeks ago, it was like they moved to using stages for a reason. Like, what's the,
There's a point.
I don't know. I don't ever have that problem. So.
Yeah,
Like-
well, yeah, you're not the priest servant. You're the soldier.
well, I have to sit in the back, otherwise he's in the way of other people. So.
Yeah, I never sit down in front of people.
Aw.
That's very.
If
No.
you sit behind me, that was your
He sits
choice.
at movies like this.
Aw.